Hey Absolvers. A lot of new players tend to ask about decks. What moves should I use? How do I build a deck? Is this a good string? Etc. For that reason, I've decided to put together this video real quick, going over the basics of deck building and how you can create a strong competitive deck. Cutting to the chase, the biggest question I still hear about deck building is, what is frame advantage? Before I go into this, I don't know if all the information I'm going to give you is correct, but in my testing I found that if I make these assumptions, it lines up with the frame data very accurately. My first assumption is that gold linking cancels all recovery frames, and that the advantage on a move indicates how long it takes to recover from the gold link window. I make this assumption because in testing confirms pre-downfall, spinning wide hook with an advantage of 10 on hit could confirm 9 frame jabs on hit when gold linked, but was unable to confirm 10 frame jabs. I've been corrected on this once, so if you feel I'm wrong, feel free to leave a comment, but if we make these two assumptions, regardless of how accurate they are, I have found that it works in practice, if not in theory. The rest of the information should be accurate from here on. So Cross Punch has a 14 frame startup. It's pretty straightforward. It takes 14 frames of animation from the time I press square, barring latency or input delay, until the move's active frames begin. Advantage is how long your opponent is stuck in hit stun or block stun. During stun, you are unable to initiate any actions. Another way to think of it is that's how quickly your opponent is able to respond after the attack connects. Cross Punch has a frame advantage of 5 on hit. So what that means is that if I gold link Cross Punch into low kick, it's jab safe. Low kick also has a startup of 14, but because of Cross Punch's frame advantage on hit, if it hits, you only have 9 frames to respond to it. Because the fastest attacks currently in the game are 10 frames, you can't interrupt me with speed. Now, if you block Cross Punch, you could interrupt low kick with a move like Mawashi. Because Cross Punch only gives 3 frames of advantage on block, that gives you 11 frames to respond, and Mawashi has a startup of 10. With that knowledge, you should always be looking for ways to make your strings jab safe. Not everything has to be jab safe, but you generally want it as an option to help you safely maintain pressure. Breaking attacks have the most frame advantage in general compared to other moves of relatively the same speed. They also have the same impact on guard as on hit, making them really good to put before heavier mix-ups, on top of the potential for guard break punish. Stopping attacks in general are a solid midway point. They have high advantage on hit compared to attacks of similar speed, but on guard they tend to be much higher as well. So, in my previous video, I talked a little bit about how you can make a true combo or block string or frame trap using frame advantage. To dive into that, let's talk about Spiral Palm. Spiral Palm is a notoriously bad attack for how slow and telegraphed it is, but it's one of my favorite attacks for its superior frame advantage. It has 12 advantage both on hit and on guard, meaning if it lands, whether it hits or is blocked, your opponent is locked down for the next 12 frames, which makes it the single best setup in the game, if you can manage to land it. After Spiral Palm, you are in the adjacent front stance, so any attack from front stance with a startup of 14 or lower is safe. Special defense is active on the 3rd frame, meaning your opponent cannot physically counter your next attack if it is 14 frames or faster. So if your opponent doesn't counter Spiral Palm, Cross Punch, Drunk Stomp, Straight Punch, Double Spike Kick. Moves like these are all safe, as they're all 14 frames or less on startup. You can make similar setups using other moves. For example, I love using the string Sidekick and a Knife Hand Strike. Sidekick's 8 advantage on hit creates a frame trap with Knife Hand Strike, which has a 10 frame startup. So anytime a move has 8 advantage or more, you do have potential to set up a frame trap. Going back to Spiral Palm, anything under 12 frames, you've created either a block string or a confirm, depending entirely on whether they blocked Spiral Palm or took the hit, provided the next attack has enough range to compensate for Spiral Palm's knockback. For example, Spiral Palm into Jumped Light Kick works as a confirm. You can feel free to play around with these, but I personally see little advantage in setups like these. Jumped Light Kick, for example, only has 4.3 stamina damage and is -3 on guard. So while Jumped Light Kick will create a block string if Spiral Palm is blocked, it's only going to put you at a disadvantage after the fact for very little reward. On the other hand, if Spiral Palm does land, then you can confirm 50 extra damage on top of the 162 that you got from Spiral Palm. That would be a total of 212 damage off of one Spiral Palm without getting a guard break. Now, to make a move like Spiral Palm work, nothing is going to make it jab safe. Collar Chop comes close, as it has 11 advantage. However, Spiral Palm's 24 frame startup still means that your opponent has 13 frames to respond. And then, of course, you'd want to find something to cover Collar Chop's startup. So when building decks, it's also important to think about not just advantage, but what alternates with what. And a lot of inexperienced players seem to think that it's a bad idea to have, for example, 3 high attacks in a row, or 3 thrusts in a row. It's true, this isn't an optimal way to build a deck, but it's much more important that the alternates mix up with the sequence than the sequence itself mixes up. So, for example, my Spiral Palm is in my bottom right alternate slot. The sequence there is under Knee Kick, Temple Knock, Uramawashi. All 3 attacks hit horizontal, all 3 from my left, and all 3 of them are quick. Spiral Palm can be used in place of any of these attacks. It's slow, it's a mid-thrust, and it hits from the right. So this sequence, in theory, should be hard to use against Forsaken. But even though the sequence all hits from one side, I can switch to the other side at will. This makes it a strong stance against Forsaken. Nothing gives me the frame advantage to safely throw Spiral Palm, but I'm also never forced to throw Spiral Palm. I can keep throwing quick attacks that all cover each other's frames, and if at any point I think that my opponent is going to get a good read, feinting is now unnecessary to punishing in that string. That's what makes a good deck, when feinting isn't required to mix up your opponent, but it makes the mix up better. So to bring this all full circle, when I start building a deck, I start with the openers. I look for strong openers with my defensive style. So for example, with Forsaken, I'm looking for 14 frame openers or less. Then I'm looking for attacks that have the highest frame advantage and damage in that category. Wallop Blow, for example, is a good Forsaken opener due to its 14 frame startup, 106 damage. It's got fantastic range as well. But it also has 5 advantage on hit, and that's probably the main thing that I'd be looking at. With openers, advantage on hit is more important than advantage on guard, since you should be confirming them on your special defense. So I put Wallop Blow on my bottom left opener. My bottom left alternate should mix up with that as well. I'm thinking less about frames and more about other properties here. For example, Wallop Blow is a 14 frame left from this stance. It's a mid thrust, and so the alternate should be a right horizontal. High-low isn't going to matter right now since Wallop Blow hits mid. We'd also prefer it to be a slower attack, but when you're talking about 14 frame attacks, making a timing mix-up can be a little bit difficult. So Back Ura would fit the bill here. Double Fist Stretch, Uramawashi, Spinning Wide Hook, Spinning Flute Swing, Low Spin Heel, Back Tripped Kick. These all work as well. But we're just going to use Back Ura for now. Now that we've decided the alternate, I want to put another move in the second slot. Since Wallop Blow doesn't change stance, I need something that will also mix up with Back Ura. Which means I need another thrust from the left, but this time it has to hit either mid or low. Since Back Ura already hits high, we don't want this attack to hit high as well. And finally, since it's the second move in the sequence, it should ideally be covered by Wallop Blow's 5 advantage on hit. So we're looking for 15 frame or less moves on top of all that. Some moves that would work would be Double Palm. Riichi Megiri would work. Low Back Fist would work. Chin Palm would work. Anything quick that hits from this side, hits mid, hits low, anything. Realistically though, since most people don't run 10 to 11 frame jabs, at least not as openers, most people run 12 frame jabs. So we could probably push this to 17 frames and maybe get Liverny here. I will do something like this for just about all of my sequences until I have 2 moves per sequence. The third attack in your deck in every sequence should be optional. You should only fill this slot if you absolutely need to. I'll add a third attack if sequences meet some of the following criteria. If the second attack and the alternate end up in the same stance. So, for example, Liverny alternates here with Bakura. If I had ended up with an attack like Uraken instead, which goes to the same stance, I might have added a third attack there. If the sequence loops on itself, so for example, Hook and Riichi Mawashi, that sequence loops on itself. I would much rather have a third attack that gets me out of that sequence, like Crouching Elbow. If I have too many sequences that end up in the same stance, so for example, my top right and my top left both end in bottom left. Preferably, I'd like one of them to go somewhere else. I might end up throwing in a third attack. Another thing would be if, say, the advantage on my second attack doesn't cover the advantage, the startup of the opener from that sequence. So, for example, if I started this stance with Slap Kick, Uraken into Slap Kick is not going to be jab safe, so I might add a third attack to bring me over to top left. Now, in case any of these things happen, it's generally better to just find a better second attack. However, if you don't feel like that's possible, or if you don't like what that does with the deck, then it is possible to add a third attack. But it's always better to have 2 moves per sequence, because then that allows you faster access to your best attacks. That's pretty much the basics of deck building. Alternates should mix up with sequences. Sequences should have enough frame advantage to cover the startup of your next attack, and ideally the alternate as well. Keep the sequences to 2 moves where possible to enable faster access to your best attacks. Rules can be bent and broken. There's nothing necessarily wrong with having a high thrust alternate with a high horizontal, as long as you have a plan for how to deal with that when you run into someone using a ducking attack or windfall. That's a bit more complicated, and for the purpose of this video, deck building basics is based on these fundamentals.